Half an hour became a full hour. The schiltrons held formation because every man understood breaking meant instant cavalry charge and certain death, but holding formation meant slow death by archery, with no hope of survival. Wallace, watching helplessly from behind his formations, had absolutely no tactical answer. His few hundred Scottish archers tried to shoot back at the Welsh longbowmen, but were massively outranged. Their shorter, weaker bows couldn't reach 200 yards effectively, and they achieved nothing. His 500 cavalry tried to charge the English archers to break up the bombardment, but were intercepted by English cavalry and driven off after brief skirmishes. Some Scottish nobles, seeing clearly the battle was already lost, abandoned the field entirely. They simply rode away from the battlefield, leaving the commoner spearmen to die. Wallace couldn't order a general advance because schiltrons were purely defensive formations with no mobility. If they tried to move forward in formation toward the archers, they would disintegrate into individual men stumbling across uneven ground who would immediately be ridden down by English cavalry waiting for exactly that opportunity. He was trapped in a tactical situation with literally no solution except hoping desperately that English archers would run out of arrows or that some miracle would intervene. They didn't run out of arrows. The arrow storm continued for approximately 2 to 3 hours of sustained bombardment. Contemporary sources don't give exact timing, but archaeological evidence and military analysis suggests that to achieve the casualty figures described in chronicles, approximately half to two-thirds of the men in the schiltrons killed or wounded, the archery phase must have lasted at least 90 minutes to 2 hours. Minimum. During that endless time, men stood in formation and died by the hundreds. Imagine the psychological horror. Standing in a tight circle of 2,000 men, completely unable to move, unable to run, unable to fight back, while arrows rain down continuously from an enemy you cannot reach. Every few seconds, an arrow hits someone near you with sickening impact. A man to your left falls with an arrow completely through his throat, blood spraying. A man behind you is struck in the face, the arrow punching through his eye socket. A man in front collapses with an arrow in his back. You stand there gripping your 12-foot pike, waiting for your inevitable turn to be hit, knowing with absolute certainty that if you break formation and run, English cavalry will kill you in seconds. But staying in formation means waiting for an arrow to find you. This wasn't combat in any traditional sense. This was systematic execution by ranged weapons. The schiltrons, which had been brilliant tactical innovations against cavalry at Stirling Bridge, became death traps against massed archery. The formations held together because Scottish discipline and courage was extraordinary, and because every man understood intellectually that breaking meant certain death, while staying meant possible survival through luck. But as casualties mounted steadily over hours, the formations began to visibly thin. Gaps appeared that couldn't be filled because too many men were dead or wounded. The outer rings of pikes became sparse and broken. Edward I, watching the systematic destruction of Scottish infantry from his command position, finally ordered his 3,000 heavy cavalry to charge. Fully armored knights on war horses thundered toward the weakened schiltrons. By this point, the Scottish formations had lost approximately half their men to arrows and were badly damaged physically and psychologically. The cavalry charge wasn't the glorious assault that English propaganda later depicted in chronicles. It was a cleanup operation, hitting already broken formations that had been systematically destroyed by archery. Some schiltrons held together long enough for cavalry to recoil from the remaining pikes. Horses still wouldn't charge into spikes, even sparse ones, but other formations collapsed immediately upon cavalry contact. Once English cavalry penetrated the formations, the slaughter accelerated exponentially. Scottish spearmen packed in tight circular formation couldn't fight individual combat against mounted knights in full armor. They were ridden down, trampled under horses, cut down from behind by cavalry swords. Men desperately tried to flee toward Calendar Wood, hoping to escape into the forest where cavalry couldn't follow. But English cavalry pursued relentlessly, cutting down hundreds during the rout. The battle became a complete rout. Wallace himself barely escaped, fleeing with a small group of survivors into the forest. His brief period as Guardian of Scotland was effectively over. Within months, he would resign his position under political pressure and return to guerrilla warfare. He would eventually be captured in 1305 and executed in London by being hanged, drawn, and quartered, becoming a martyr but never again leading Scottish armies in pitched battle. The casualty figures at Falkirk are disputed by different chroniclers, with estimates ranging from 2,000 to 7,000 Scots killed. English casualties were minimal, perhaps 200 to 300 total, mostly cavalry who got too close to intact schiltrons and were unhorsed or wounded. If we accept the middle estimate of 4,000 to 5,000 Scottish dead, this represents 40 to 50% of Wallace's entire army killed in a single afternoon, a catastrophic loss by any military standard. The battlefield was literally littered with bodies bristling with arrows. Contemporary descriptions mention that many corpses had 5 to 10 arrows embedded in them, stark evidence of the continuous bombardment over hours. English soldiers walked the battlefield methodically after the fighting ended, finishing wounded Scots with daggers and systematically collecting arrows from corpses to reuse. This practice, harvesting arrows from dead enemies, was standard military procedure because arrows were expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. A single arrow required skilled craftsmanship, cutting and precisely shaping the wooden shaft, forging the steel bodkin point in a furnace, preparing feather fletching, binding everything together with twine and glue. Medieval armies couldn't afford to waste arrows, so after every major battle, soldiers would spend hours pulling arrows from corpses, washing the blood off, and collecting them for reuse in future engagements. At Falkirk, English forces likely recovered tens of thousands of arrows, blood-stained, torn from Scottish bodies, some still attached to fragments of flesh, to be cleaned and reused against future enemies. The strategic consequences of Falkirk were immediate and long-lasting. Edward I re-established English control over southern Scotland, garrisoning castles and major towns. Wallace's military reputation was destroyed, and his political position collapsed completely. Scottish nobles who had reluctantly followed a commoner now openly criticized his leadership and tactical decisions. Wallace resigned as Guardian and was replaced by noble commanders. Scotland's resistance to English occupation continued, but Falkirk had proven definitively that Scottish infantry tactics couldn't defeat English combined arms of cavalry and longbows. The battle also established the English longbow as a war-winning weapon that would dominate European battlefields for the next century. Edward and his commanders recognized that massed archery could break any infantry formation, no matter how brave or disciplined the soldiers. This tactical lesson would be refined over the next 50 years and applied devastatingly at Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, where French cavalry and infantry would suffer the exact same fate as Wallace's schiltrons, unable to close with English positions through sustained arrow bombardment. Falkirk was the first major battle where longbow archery proved tactically decisive, the beginning of a military revolution that would dominate European warfare for over a century. The human cost of Falkirk extended far beyond immediate battlefield casualties. 4,000 to 5,000 Scottish dead meant that entire communities across Scotland lost their men simultaneously. These were not professional soldiers who chose military careers. They were farmers who had been conscripted or volunteered, who left families and farms to fight for Scottish independence. Their deaths created immediate economic hardship for surviving families, widows with no male support, children with no fathers, farms with no laborers to work fields. Scotland's total population in 1298 was roughly 500,000 to 700,000. This means Falkirk killed nearly 1% of the entire Scottish population in a single afternoon of fighting. Proportionally, this would be equivalent to a modern battle killing 3 million Americans. The impact on national consciousness was profound and traumatic. Scottish resistance to English occupation continued for another 16 years until Robert the Bruce finally won independence at Bannockburn in 1314. But Falkirk remained a national trauma, a bitter reminder that courage and determination weren't enough against superior technology and tactics. The battle also hardened attitudes on both sides of the conflict. English forces treated Scots with increasing brutality after Falkirk, systematically burning more villages, executing prisoners without trial, implementing terror tactics specifically designed to break Scottish will to resist. Scottish forces responded with their own atrocities, raiding northern England and deliberately killing English civilians. The wars of Scottish independence became progressively more vicious after Falkirk, a cycle of violence and counter-violence that lasted decades and poisoned relations. The tactical lessons of Falkirk were studied intensely by military commanders across Europe. The schiltron, which had seemed invincible at Stirling Bridge just 10 months earlier, was revealed to have a critical, fatal weakness. It was a purely defensive formation with no mobility and no answer to ranged weapons. Later, commanders would try to solve this fundamental problem by giving pike formations their own ranged support, or by using terrain to limit exposure to archery. But the fundamental vulnerability remained unsolved. Infantry formations designed specifically to stop cavalry charges were inherently vulnerable to archery, while formations dispersed enough to minimize archery casualties couldn't stop cavalry charges. This created a rock-paper-scissors dynamic in medieval warfare, where combined arms, cavalry, infantry, and archers working together in coordination defeated any single arm operating alone. Edward I understood this tactical principle intuitively and applied it perfectly at Falkirk. His successors would refine the system further, creating the English military dominance of the 100 Years' War. But the price of this tactical innovation was measured in thousands of Scottish corpses on the field at Falkirk, men who stood in formation and died by the thousands because their commander had no tactical counter to mast. Archery. The mythology around Falkirk developed very differently than other medieval battles. Stirling Bridge became a legendary victory celebrated in Scottish national memory, and later dramatically, if inaccurately, portrayed in films like Braveheart. Falkirk, by contrast, was a defeat and thus much less celebrated in popular culture, though it was arguably more militarily significant because it demonstrated the fundamental limits of Scottish infantry tactics and the overwhelming power of English longbow archery. Wallace himself became a martyr when brutally executed in 1305, but his defeat at Falkirk was often downplayed in nationalist narratives that preferred to focus on his earlier victory. Modern military historians recognize Falkirk as a genuine turning point where Scottish hopes for quick victory through infantry tactics were permanently crushed, forcing a return to guerrilla warfare and political maneuvering that would eventually lead to Bannockburn. The battle also starkly revealed the deep class tensions within Scottish resistance. Scottish cavalry, almost exclusively nobles, largely fled the battlefield or refused to engage at Falkirk, cynically abandoning the common spearmen to die under arrow bombardment. This class division would continue to plague Scottish military efforts until Robert the Bruce unified noble and common resistance under his charismatic leadership. The archaeological evidence from Falkirk is frustratingly limited because the battlefield has been heavily developed over centuries, and most physical remains were not preserved. Unlike Towton, where a mass grave was discovered in the 1990s containing hundreds of skeletons, Falkirk's dead were probably buried in multiple small graves scattered across the area, or simply left on the field to decompose naturally, as was unfortunately common practice in medieval battles. Some contemporary accounts mention that bodies lay exposed on the field for days after the battle because there were simply too many corpses to bury quickly, and English forces were more concerned with consolidating military control than with burial duties. The stench of rotting corpses in summer heat would have been absolutely overwhelming. Medieval battlefields were horrific scenes after fighting ended, completely unlike sanitized modern depictions. Thousands of bodies in various states of injury and decomposition, wounded men crying desperately for help that wouldn't come. Scavengers and local peasants stripping corpses of anything remotely valuable, weapons, armor, clothing, boots, priests moving among the dying, giving last rites to soldiers. At Falkirk specifically, most of the dead would have been Scottish spearmen, their bodies bristling with multiple arrows, their faces showing the terror of men who died unable to fight back against an enemy they couldn't reach. English casualties were minimal and mostly treated with much more care because they included nobles who could be properly buried with religious ceremony or whose bodies could be returned to families. On the 22nd of July 1298, 1,500 Welsh longbowmen demonstrated conclusively that the future of medieval warfare belonged to ranged weapons, not close combat. They systematically massacred Wallace's spear wall, shooting thousands of arrows continuously into packed formations where Scottish courage and discipline meant absolutely nothing against technological and tactical superiority combined with geometric advantage. 4,000 to 500 Scots died in schiltrons that became killing pens, standing in tight formation, being shot to death for 2 to 3 hours because breaking formation meant instant cavalry charge and certain death, but staying in formation meant slow death by arrows with no hope. William Wallace's brief moment as Scotland's military savior ended in blood-soaked ground near Falkirk. His tactical innovation of the schiltron revealed as fatally vulnerable to massed archery. His reputation destroyed, his political power collapsed within months. He resigned as guardian, eventually captured 1,305, and executed by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. England learned that longbows could systematically break any infantry formation, a lesson confirmed repeatedly over the next century at Crécy and Agincourt, where French forces would die the same way. Scotland learned that independence would not come through conventional pitched battles, but through guerrilla warfare and political endurance, until Robert the Bruce won at Bannockburn 1,314. 4,000 common Scottish men learned in their final moments on that July afternoon that sometimes courage is not enough against superior technology, and that dying for your country in a defensive formation while arrows rain down from an enemy you cannot reach is not glorious. It's just death. Subscribe to Great History for more battles where tactical innovation created systematic slaughter.